share the three core considerations for cyber security, and dive into what underlying threat environments the newly proposed Bill C-26 is addressing, as well as penalties of failure. You'll also learn the top 5 things you need to do if you have been breached and what happens next. We are privileged to host 3 leading experts in the field of cybersecurity and privacy for our discussion, and they are Tristan Kim, who is the managing partner at Joseon Group. Tristan is also the co-founder of the Joseon Group. He leads the company's business development and manages cyber advisory practice. And prior to his current role, Tristan co-founded a grassroots project with the Toronto Police Service called Information Security Toronto. This outreach program was designed to give back to the business community through sharing of information, education, and networking of our business from cyber threats. As well, we're joined by Jason Marilla. Jason, with over 20 years of experience in the IT and cybersecurity field, is a seasoned tech entrepreneur, an enterprise network architect, and a threat hunter. With a combined skill set and experience, Jason is valued to many clients across the SME space in Canada and the US, and Jason is the managing partner of the Joseon Group, an advisory member of InfoSec TO, and also a best-selling author. And we're also pleased to be joined by Imran Ahmad, who is the partner, head of technology, co-head of information governance, privacy, and cybersecurity at the Toronto and Montreal offices of Norton, Rose, and Fulbright. Imran often acts as a breach counsel in the event of a cybersecurity incident, such as data or privacy breach, and has extensive experience in managing complex security incidents and cross-border breaches. He also provides representation in the event of an investigation and enforcement action or litigation. Imran is the author of Canada's first legal incident preparation and response handbook titled Cybersecurity in Canada, A Guide to Best Practices, Planning and Management. And there are 2 editions out, one from August 2017 and one in March 2021. In his privacy law practice, Imran also advises clients on compliance with all Canadian federal and provincial privacy and data management laws, and he has a particular focus on cross-border data transfer issues and enterprise-wide governance programs related to privacy and information governance. Imran is the former chair of the Privacy and Access to Information section of the Ontario Bar Association and is also the adjunct professor at U of T's Faculty of Law, where he teaches cybersecurity and privacy law. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. And jumping right into this section where we're going to impart a bunch of knowledge, I'd like to start with Tristan. I was hoping you could kind of set the context for us. What's going on in the space of cybersecurity? I recently heard at a conference that a cyber attack occurs every 11 seconds in Canada. Now, not all of those are successful, thankfully, but I'm wondering if you could explain to us how cyber gangs work and how they're structured so that they can generate that level of activity.
Absolutely, Brad. So first of all, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining today. With that question, Brad, I mean, in terms of the cyber gangs and how they can generate, I guess, this sort of like activity is the method of using their tools, right? So they're going to be generating campaigns. We gotta take the old, I guess, thought of like, you know, there's a someone's in the basement, it's a lone hacker with a hoodie on and trying to hack the systems of a large corporation. I mean, those days are, I mean, some are still, I guess, doing that, but what we're dealing with normally for all the, I guess, attacks and all the breaches that are happening are criminal enterprise organizations, right? So they do have campaigns that are known using their phishing tools, mainly to socially engineer all of us as victims. And for the ones that did not go through training or are not aware of these latest tactics, we can easily fall victim to clicking a bad link or opening a bad attachment that could basically release the malware that they intended to release into the network. And that's pretty much how it begins in terms of the root cause. And so the 11 seconds that you brought up in terms of it's true because basically, every day we're seeing not just a growing number of emails and phishing emails in our inboxes that sometimes slip through the cracks out of between our filters, but we're also seeing a lot of SMS text messages that are malicious, and also even voice calls, right? So a lot of spam calls and a lot of scam calls, I call them too, right? But that's what we're dealing with here.
Okay. And when you talk about these criminal organizations, how are they set up? Are they,
Yeah.
is it like a company, or is it just a bunch of people who get online like this and decide they're going to work together, or is it more formalized in structure?
Yeah, actually, it's very, very sophisticated, more than you think, right? So think of our own businesses, think of our own companies. We have a hierarchy with the leaders on top, and then basically we have different departments dealing with certain tasks and certain job and roles. I'd say this, and I did this to one of our information security Toronto talks, where just to give the audience the understanding of how this operation works, think of the sales team in your organization. And the criminal organization would have the same thing as a sales team. They'll be hunting for new victims. So the spray and slay tactics, using their tools to get as many contacts to kind of click anything that comes into their notification or filters, saying that, oh, we have one culprit that actually clicked or opened an attachment. That's when they'll pursue the next stage in terms of compromising and exploiting their network. But it's large criminal enterprise organizations. These are the cyber gangs we're dealing with. They're sophisticated. You got to understand this, that the gap between the good and the bad is always going to be there, and it's always going to grow. Due to the fact that these guys are thinking about 100% of their time is to basically break into our systems, right? And most of our time is just worrying about operating our business, and fractions of that time is catered to defending against cyber attacks still, right? More and more it's changed overall, like in the over the years, but we're still at that, hey, we're only here to operate our business, and only a fraction of that time is to focus on the cyber defense. So that gap is always going to be there. That's number one, what we want to think about. And not only do we have cyber gangs that aren't tied to any sort of like, state-sponsored actors, we're dealing with now cyber terrorism, right? So cyber threat actors, and some of them are on the sanctions list in terms of China, North Korea, and Russia being the more common, I guess, nations. But yeah, we're dealing with that, and in terms of the nation's defense right now, it's not just more the private sector that has to be concerned, but we're also dealing with state-sponsored attacks on critical infrastructure in our nation. So how does that tie down to us? Well, let's just think of if the telecommunications or the utilities were to get hacked today. I mean, it's literally powering our laptops right now, right? So that's how it affects the private sector. But all in all, right now, the government is obviously discussing this. This is a threat, and it's a concern for not just our nation, but everywhere else. But it's knowledge and also sharing of information is a crucial factor here for everybody.
Excellent. And if I can take that comment then, because that's what I keep reading, is that this is growing. But the World Economic Forum came out with their 2022 risk report, and they listed cyber risk as number 7 out of 10 over the next 2 years, dropping to number 8 from 2 to 5 years as far as a future risk. And then in 10 years, they just don't list cyber risk in the top 10 anymore. And I'm wondering, when I hear that side of the equation, and then I heard recently that Munich Re said they expect cyber risk premiums to outpace property premiums in the future. So you've got two sides of the, I guess, spectrum there. How do you see the cyber market evolving, and what are the new threat vectors that you see coming?
Yeah, interesting. Me being in the industry, I'm going to say that cyber is here to stay. It's actually going to grow. So I wanted to take that maybe, not to, put a wedge in anyone's, I guess, top lists or something like that. But I'm speaking from reality here.
Yeah.
Someone that's in the industry, dealing with the customers that are faced with challenges that are constantly changing. the fundamental part about this whole list is that we have to understand the fundamentals first. Number one, I think, or what I can confidently say is that we're producing massive amounts of data every day. So organizations, not just personally, but organizations are producing more and more data. With more and more data that we produce, there's going to be more and more storage that we're going to have to store these this data too. That just means that cyber risk and cyber threats are continuously going to grow. As long as that data grows, so is the cyber risk, because again, the bad actors are after your data, right? This is where ransomware will work. If your data is sensitive enough, if it's your data that's intellectual property, it's your data that's national security. Like, this is the stuff that they're after. So as long as the data is there, there's going to be cyber risk. And I would say that, in terms of ranking it, I would, in my consultation or advisory to my customers, is especially to the stakeholders, is to align your business operations and business decisions in parallel with cyber. So cybersecurity should be a boardroom discussion from the business operations and business decision side. So any business decision should be made in parallel with cybersecurity. So that's why you need to have a chief information security officer in the boardroom always and moving forward. And I think cyber risk should be treated as such moving forward. Whatever the ranking number is, it's going to be there. So
Okay.
that's that. Sorry, could you repeat is there another question for that, or?
Just if there's any threat vectors that you see emerging, as the next business email compromise or ransomware, or is it still ransomware?
Yeah, I mean, ransomware is a very, very highly effective, execution by the bad actors, right? So once they are able to, compromise your network and, basically isolate and gather exactly what they wanted, including exfiltration of data, all the data that they know they can leverage against you, and they pull that trigger, it's a very, very effective, execution of their ways. Ransomware is here to stay. Unfortunately, cyber risk and cyber threats is going to change in terms of the tactics and strategies that they use. In terms of the, known threats and known common threats that everyone knows, ransomware is here, business email compromise is always going to be here. I want to maybe concentrate on 3 points on some of the blind spots that I think is good relevant to this. I think we have to consider that the insurance industry as well is already taking a look at this because we do work with insurance companies when we look at these controls and putting together the clients to be ready for insurance, is cloud security. Number one, I think the identity access management or privileged access management within your cloud environment is crucial right now. And it's not on the applications yet. However, this is what I call one of the blind spots. I think this is the area where if you don't have proper monitoring or management within your cloud environment, this is basically the next vector. And actually, it already is. I would say that 85% of some of the activity, including business email compromise, is done through cloud, right? So, I mean, they say that almost everyone's hand is in the cookie jar. And when they say that, is because everyone has access to certain cloud assets and in systems, right? So the trouble or the challenge here is to continuously and efficiently make sure that you have your users accessing the right systems and the only systems that they should be accessing, not more than that. Because if their account gets compromised, that's when trouble happens, right? The second point is third-party vendor and supply chain management. I think this is an overlooked area. Actually, it's not overlooked. I take that back. This is looked at right now stringently, especially with us. However, it's the challenges in the industry itself and how things are actually structured. We can only gain so much from the questionnaires or the due diligence that we do and ask our supply chain partners and suppliers, hey, are you cyber secure? Do you adhere to certain frameworks, or do you have these controls in place? Much like your insurance application, we're subject to basically entrusting that response from our suppliers. And so in terms of the solutions that are out there, it's not perfect yet, and that's where another focus should be in terms of where the cyber threats are going to be emerging. So I'd say that's Number one, cloud, and also third-party supply chain management. Last but not, sorry, actually, before even that is phishing. Phishing is always going to be here. So email phishing, we all know this. We're going to get spam emails. We're going to have to watch out for malicious links. We're going to have to watch out for not to open malicious attachments. But we got to watch out for schmishing, so SMS phishing, and also vishing, which is voice phishing. So we're going to get these calls now and on our mobile device. That's the next vector of the attacks that are going to come through mobile devices and our smartphones. And last but not least, this was interesting and actually intrigued me a lot to look into more and more even after this, is quantum computing. So this one here, the quantum computing is, we've talked about this years ago, and right now here we are until 2022. It's here. It's the scary part is that it's here. It's actually, there's a lot of good that quantum computing can produce in the world, especially for climate change. I mean, the ability to compute on a very fast mass scale for the same amount of work and more is amazing. So we can actually combat climate change because we could reduce a large amount of energy that's been consumed for the regular compute that we have today. Now, that's the unknown part, is the cybersecurity component. So the threats that we've been hearing and we've been seeing is the ability of quantum computing to decrypt our encryption today. So I took a read and I saw in a webinar actually that was held by Jamil Farshi, the CISO at Equifax, and this was one of the areas that worried him a lot. And he's made a point that organizations should be thinking about this now rather than this being the future, because it's already here. And so this is definitely more of a boardroom talk and saying, hey, are we resilient to quantum computing encryption, right? So that's maybe one of the questions to start off in the boardrooms today.
Okay, well, that's terrifying. Thank you. It's bad enough to have to worry about your password, never mind AI and quantum computing undoing it. So that's fantastic. Thank you. That's a threat vector I've not heard of. And actually, speaking of the threats, I just want to jump over to Jason. And I know you're the best-selling author of You Are the Number One Target, which is all about cyber risk. What is the core message of that book? And maybe within the context of what Tristan just told us about some of those threat vectors.
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Brad, for inviting us over to have a conversation with everyone involved. With regards to your question, the reason the book was written actually was in order to help small business or just business owners in general or business leaders to truly determine, okay, well, are we doing the right things to protect our organization, right? It's an easy read, and I had a lot of fun putting it together. And the best thing about it is that the proceeds actually don't go to me. They go straight to a charity called St. Jude's Children's Charity. If you're wondering why it's not going to Sick Kids Foundation, it's because the majority of my co-authors are American and I was the only Canadian on it. So I kind of got vetoed on it. Yeah, the book was definitely meant to help business owners in general or business leaders, whether they be in North America or anywhere in the world, to help determine what they need to do to better protect their organization.
You mentioned business owners. I'm going to bring up another quote here, number. As of 2020, there were 1.2 million small and medium enterprises in Canada, and 98% of those are less than 100 employees.
Yep.
Do those organizations have less of a risk than an RBC or a CIBC when it comes to cyber?
To be honest, they probably have a larger risk than RBC or any of the larger organizations. And the reason for that is because they lack the resources, right? Most companies that are 100 and under, 100 employees and under, tend to not have the skill sets to better prepare themselves for a cyber attack or just even recover from it, right? So most of the time, these organizations tend to have external, IT support organizations like managed service providers that help them. And for the most part, a lot of the time, we actually make it clear to the organizations that we work with that IT support or IT expertise aren't necessarily, aren't aren't necessarily the same as cyber expertise, right? So IT people, not that they're not skilled at it, it's just that their concentration in supporting an organization is making sure that the systems are up and running, that the uptime is good, 99.9% uptime. And like I said, it's not like they're experts, or it's not like they're not concentrating on the security. It's just a challenge that they find is that they're also running around ragged with lack of resources. And therefore, it's always important to bring in a security expert to look over their work, or at least collaborate with the organization's IT teams in order to ensure that not only uptime is held up and that IT is efficiently running, but that security is part and parcel of that objective.
Okay, and that being a great entree to where I was going next, which is, what does a threat hunter like yourself do? What does a Tuesday in February look like for you?
So a threat hunter, the general description of it, and threat hunting is, by the way, a relatively new thing. Most of the time, in the cybersecurity world, there's an offensive security analyst or a penetration tester that does ethical hacking. Their job is essentially to look at vulnerabilities and prove that they're exploitable so that they can notify an organization of the things that they need to fix. And on the flip side of that, there's incident responders where, they're unfortunately the people that have to help the organization to identify the threats and the issues that have already occurred. I, on the other hand, being a threat hunter, is in the middle. Primary job of a threat hunter is to proactively search for cyber threats that are lurking undetected on a network. So no one's called an incident responder quite yet, and no one has actually done a sanctioned penetration test. Our job really is to look at the network and see if there are hidden attackers in the network that have stayed on the network to essentially find information or other pieces that they can leverage against the company in order to either carry out the stealing of data, the stealing of credentials, or ransomware for that matter, right? So our job really as a threat hunter is to look for those indicators of compromise or artifacts that would lead us to believe and find the threat actors before they do further damage. That is a typical Tuesday, to be honest with you. And for the most part, by the way, there's two forms of threat hunting. There's doing a compromise assessment, which is essentially where a threat hunter is now on the receiving end of a confirmed breach, and that they're trying to find where the compromises are on the network. Mm-hmm. And the proactive threat hunt, where essentially we're looking for the bad guys before they can do damage on the network. And threat hunting is becoming more and more prevalent in the industry, just because of the fact that, before ransomware occurs, and I wanted to state this clearly, ransomware is usually the last thing that ever happens. And it's usually a situation where a bad guy or a malicious actor has already been in the network, and they've been sifting data, and they've collected information, they've exfiltrated it and sent it off to their servers. And then they hit you with a ransomware to extort you for your funds. So our job really is to make sure that it doesn't get to that point, or depending, I guess, on when we're called in. If it's proactive, it's better. When it's reactive, it becomes a more high stress situation.
And proactive, is that what the honeypot is used for, to try and get these lurking threat actors to take the bait, so to speak? How does that work?
So honeypots, honeypots are definitely used by threat hunters. It's not as common. Typically, honeypots can be multiple things, right? So they can be either servers or workstations that are sitting on the network, and they're made to look like they have valuable information on there. But in fact, what they're supposed to do is alert the IT or the security team of an attack or the result of an access onto that honeypot. So for example, you could have a Word document that's been opened or manipulated, and everybody on the company side, the organization side, should know that that file should never be opened, because that's meant to be something that, pardon me, something that's meant to be a bait in order to bait the malicious actors into clicking on it or accessing it, right? So, for example, you can create a document called, company payroll, And no one is supposed to access that document on the network. They know better that's a honeypot. But if that is ever accessed, that would signal the IT team or the security team to take action and investigate and find out what's going on. The reason why the honeypots are not they're used by threat hunters, but not as commonly used by threat hunters, because the intention with honeypots is to really find a way to bait the malicious actor, but keeping in mind that now the malicious actor is actually on the network, and therefore you want to prevent that as much as possible. You don't want them to get into the network, but if they do get into the network, it's a matter of making sure that you can respond quickly. And typically when a honeypot is triggered, that's when some threat hunting does occur. Sometimes, the internal IT team would do it, or sometimes they would call a person like myself to figure out what's happened already.
And when you say that they're already in, then for somebody who doesn't understand technology, just in plain English,
Sure.
how do you try and get them out at that point, like from a technology perspective? And then we'll talk to Imran about the legal and cyber coaching incidents part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So a lot of the time when these threat actors have already made it into the network and they've established a beachhead or a base of command, like a workstation that no one else is really checking too often, or a server that's been forgotten. The intention for a threat hunter is to first find indicators of compromise, to determine, okay, well, what's actually going on? Is there actually information to lead to the fact that there is malicious activity going on in the network? And as such, once we've discovered that there is malicious activity happening on the network, though it's covert, part of our job is to turn into more forensics analysts at that point to determine, okay, well, how did this start? How did this get in? And sometimes, from a threat hunter's perspective, it may require a conversation with a person like Imran to say, hey, Imran, something's happening here. You might need to step in because this might have to fall into privilege, or we'd have to bring in a forensics team to essentially say, okay, well, we've determined that they've attacked this area. They might have grabbed information or exfiltrated data, and it would be a good idea to determine how it happened, where it's happening, the blast radius of the attack, how exactly it's affected the network, and from that point on, once we've determined those pieces of information, then we can work towards eradicating the bad actor. And to answer your question, the eradication of the bad actor can take many forms. It could take the form of the removal of malicious files that they've implemented or installed. It could take the form of installing endpoint detection and response tools that would proactively work towards removing these indicators of compromise or artifact on the network. And by the way, when you use an EDR tool or an endpoint detection and response tool, it's important for the threat hunter to provide the hashes or the information to the EDR tool to better detect these things. Because typically when you're in a threat hunting situation, it's because the automated tools like an EDR or an antivirus have missed it completely. And the reason for that is because in a threat hunting situation or in a breach situation in general, most of the time, you're not really trying to defeat a piece of software. Unlike back in the day, 5-8 years ago, an antivirus would be sufficient. Nowadays, a threat actor or a bad actor on your network is actually a human being looking to trick your systems and looking to trick the people that are using the IT systems so that they can stay in there longer and eventually compromise or extort you for money. And that's why it's important to work together with both the IT team and the forensics team, and of course, the breach coaches to say, okay, guys, this is the situation. Let's sort this out.
Okay, and that's a perfect entree to bring Imran into the conversation. When you get the call from Jason or Tristan and Imran, what is it that a breach coach does? And what are maybe 5 things that people need to be aware of if they are hacked that they need to do?
I know that's a great question. Thanks, Brad. And I just want to echo what Jason and Tristan said at the beginning of their remarks. I want to thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to exchange these ideas. And I can speak from personal experience. Both Tristan and Jason are really experts in the area. We work with them pretty regularly, and they give really good, solid advice to clients. So I was listening to their remarks very carefully. In terms of the breach coach work, it's interesting. It's just to give folks a bit of visibility where this term even came from. If you were to go back to the insurance world 15, 20 years ago, there was no concept of a cyber breach coach. We had privacy counsel, which was identified as a resource amongst multiple vendors if you had a privacy related event where you could call on them. And that role evolved over time. It became that of a breach coach. And really the breach coach wears a few hats. And you've probably heard this at other conferences, but the breach coach acts as a quarterback. But quarterback for what exactly, and why have we selected the breach coach? Why is he or she so special? The one thing we have as lawyers, which is unique to our legal system, not just in Canada, but globally, is the ability to establish privilege. I know Jason and Tristan alluded to this earlier. And what privilege is basically a safe space between the client and the lawyer to be able to exchange information and for the lawyer to give advice. If the client is nervous that if I share information with my lawyer, that could be misused against me in litigation or a regulatory investigation, they may hold back. And as a result of that, the lawyer will not be able to give a fulsome advice or the best advice they can provide because they don't have all the facts. So it's a fundamental basis of our legal system that when a lawyer is talking with their client, they can actually have that safe space, number one. Number two, and when you're dealing with that lawyer piece, it actually can extend to third-party vendors. So why is that relevant? Although I'm pretty technical and I know technology, I'm not a forensic investigator. Very few lawyers, if any, are at all. And if they are, they're probably doing the technical stuff, they're not doing the legal stuff or vice versa. So for me to be able to give informed advice to the client, hey, you better notify someone, you better report this incident to the regulator, or you need to send out these letters to impacted individuals, I need to be able to say, I've looked at the following information, and that following information is typically through an investigation. And those experts will then be producing reports, communications, which are deemed to be, as we call, attorney work product. It is basically designed so that I can give legal advice to the client. So role number one, the breach coach is to be the quarterback so that we get the right players in the room under that legal privilege umbrella to make sure that it's as safe to talk and discuss options. The options clients have are never good and bad. It's very rare for them to say, yeah, A clearly versus B because A is better than B. No, it's often bad and worse. You're making very difficult and challenging decisions, right? Do we talk to the threat actor? Do we wait a bit longer to make a payment for a ransom, recognizing that some of our employee data may get leaked as a result of it? There's always a risk. So how do we balance those very difficult decisions in an imperfect world of information? So our role, like I said, number one, breach coach to be establishing privilege. Role number two is more obvious to our role is to give legal advice or navigate through legal requirements. So we talk a lot about privacy, and that's something I know we'll talk about a bit later as well. But in addition to that, you have business relationships. If you're an auto parts manufacturer, for example, you're a just-in-time model, you got to get product out. If you're going to be down for 24 to 72 or more hours, you're going to have to tell people. And those people actually have contracts with you that require you to tell them even before the 72 hours have expired. So what does that mean? And what's the financial loss going to look like? And what are you required under those contracts to do? The other piece of legal that falls into that is dealing with law enforcement. And I'm really impressed with the work Tristan and team have done over the years working with Toronto Police and other law enforcement agencies, because law enforcement generally gets a bad rap. That, these hackers are sitting some other part of the world, they can't catch them, investigation take years. Some of that may be true, but there are some good success stories. We're actually catching bad guys. There's a great case that came out this year in the Vachon case where a hacker who belonged to the NetWalker group was arrested and proceeds from his criminal activities were seized, and restitution, meaning victim organization were able to recover some of the losses that they suffered as a result of those extortion attempts. So we also advise on how do you deal with law enforcement, when to bring them in, what is appropriate in terms of disclosure without waiving any privilege piece. And then lastly, and this may not be exactly top five things to keep in mind, but I'm happy to expand on it a bit later, is the communication part. We're not comms experts as lawyers, but as I mentioned, you have imperfect information. In the first 24, 72 hours, you have an idea what's going on, but you don't have facts, or at least not complete set of facts. And so you still have to put communication out to your board, to your team members, your employees, business partners, maybe the public, maybe a regulator, maybe individuals, consumers, if they're impacted as well. So what do you say? And can you want to avoid a situation where you're overstating the situation, becoming too alarmist? We've been ransom attacked. All of your data is out there. Good luck. That is just opening yourself up for litigation. But you also don't want to minimize saying, yeah, we had a small incident, when in reality, you're completely paralyzed, because that can actually come back and hurt you in litigation. You also want to avoid a situation where you're speculating. We think it was because somebody got through an RDP port that had not been secured. Well, you don't know. Let's get the investigation done. Let's find the facts, and then you can communicate. But in those communication pieces, you want to make sure it's going out, even if it's going to employees internally, assume it can get out publicly. And so let's state it as accurately as we can. But I'll stop there. There's so much more we can unpack.
Well, and actually, you just covered off 4 excellent points, some of which I hadn't even thought of. But I guess when you listen to the context and the threat environment that Tristan outlined and Jason went into more detail, I know there's a new proposed cybersecurity bill, Bill C-26. Will that actually address the concerns that Jason and Tristan have brought up? And will it do it effectively? And I'm not looking for legal advice, just your opinion on where that's going.
It's a good question, and I'm going to editorialize a bit. So take what I say in the next few minutes with a grain of salt. Regrettably, and I'm a super proud Canadian, but regrettably, Canada has been on the back end in terms, or in a bit of a laggard in terms of our legislative regime. We often play catch up when our American or European colleagues adopt legislation and force us to change. So the bill you're referring to, C-26, is a bill that was tabled back in June. It focuses primarily on critical infrastructure, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it's not like one day the legislator or the government woke up and said, we'll make cybersecurity a priority. What ended up actually happening was, after Colonial Pipeline in the US, which paralyzed and had a huge consumer impact on the US East Coast, President Biden issued executive orders to pretty much every single agency to beef up their cyber initiatives and guidelines. The Critical Infrastructure Agency in the US, CISA, has guidelines on cyber reporting and cyber risk management in the critical infrastructure space. And so Canada, being the closest business partner to the US, heavily integrated in pipeline energy, our electrical grid east, west, and Texas are integrated, believe it or not, in a meaningful way. Our supply chain for automotive and others are integrated. Our financial systems are integrated. A risk to Canada, like we were talking about third-party vendors, is actually a risk to the US as well. So this piece of legislation that was proposed is really a reflection of what's going on in the US to make sure we're consistent across the board. So that's the background. But to your question, will it address the risks? Probably not as much as you and I may be wanting it to, for 2 reasons. One, Tristan correctly described the evolution of cyber risk, and they're constantly changing. Laws are always playing catch up. And the law is not designed really to address a particular type of incident. The law is actually designed to do 2 things. One, critical infrastructure. So not all organizations are subject to it. It's really like telecommunications, rail and trains and others. Could be banking system, healthcare in critical areas, and so on. But all it does, it requires organizations to have a cyber incident response plan, and also to have a reporting mechanism up to government so they can track what's happening in the critical infrastructure space. That really doesn't address, like, it can give you a bit of a monitoring ability, but it won't really address, meaningfully, how do you get to the root cause of those issues. I think it's still better than nothing. It's a good step in the right direction. Based on what we are seeing federally, the law is going to likely pass. I don't see anybody challenging it or asking for changes that are meaningful in a significant way. And what clients are thinking about right now is 90 days after the law is passed, you as an organization in that space need to have a cybersecurity incident response plan if you're a critical infrastructure.
Okay, wow. All right. And so that's the critical infrastructure piece, Bill C-26. There's also another proposed bill that is going to change the privacy laws that we know as PIPEDA today. I know you've got some insight there as well. Could you explain that? And then how does that work together with Bill C-26?
Yeah, great question. And actually, around the same time that Bill C-26 was introduced, C-27 was as well. I like to give a bit of history for any of these bills because, knowing where they're coming from actually informs where they may be going as well and what the logic is in terms of enforcement as well. So Canada has had privacy laws for roughly about 20 plus years. And we have a federal regime and we have a provincial one in Alberta, BC, and Quebec. But in addition to those four, there are roughly about 24 different privacy and data protection laws, public sector, healthcare, government, and so on. So there's a variety of them, but the key ones on the private sector side are PIPEDA federally, Quebec and Alberta and BC provincially. These laws were adopted 20 years ago, built on an ombudsman model. This may be actually a bit surprising to some of the listeners, but when Amazon was a small little company doing a little bit of e-commerce, the industry got together in the late 1990s and said, we should have a code of conduct, which eventually became PIPEDA. So if you read the law, it actually reads like a code of conduct. It's not actually a real statute, to be honest with you. The Schedule 1 at the end is really just a code of conduct. In the meanwhile, you probably all heard GDPR in Europe got adopted, and that was probably one of the most onerous piece of legislation that set the gold standard. And why? Because for the first time, it wasn't just a recommendation or an ombudsman model, but it was actually backed up with significant financial penalties. When you're talking about global turnover or percentage of your global revenues for $1 billion+ company, you start taking notice on compliance right away. And what was interesting was GDPR had these pieces where if you are transferring data to another country, or to another company in a different country, you have to ensure that they're affording them the same level of protections. Now, Canada's PIPEDA was early 2000s, and here you have in the late 2018's range, a very onerous legislation. Canada had to play catch up. So we can't be too onerous because we're relatively a small economy compared to the global economy, but we don't want to be one which we're behind the curveball. So this new bill was introduced recently. There was a previous attempt with C11 that died on the order paper when we went to election, but this one was reintroduced essentially with the same model. Two really big issues, especially I know some of the audience member are part of underwriting teams or part of claims teams. Two things to keep in mind with this piece of legislation. One, there are significant penalties, so very similar to Europe, the global turnover percentage, so real teeth for the first time. But the second piece, which is super important, is it is introducing a specialized tribunal. So a specialized tribunal that will allow private right of action. So this is where an individual will say, I may not want to go to court because it's really expensive going to Ontario Superior Court. I have to file a statement of claim and do a defense, and that can cost me $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 plus. But as an individual citizen, I may bring a private right of action before a tribunal where I don't need to get a lawyer. I can self-represent. There are limits and conditions around what's being proposed for the tribunal, but the risk profile for a victim organization that may be subject to that private right of action, especially when it's a material and widespread breach vis-a-vis consumers, is going to be quite significant potentially.
And if I can just add, when you talk about that there were fines you talked about, and then you're talking about a tribunal, are those two different financial penalties that a company would get possibly?
Yeah, this is, I mean, it's a great question. So a couple of things just to mention right off the bat. Firstly, both of those pieces of legislation have not been adopted yet. So they're still before Parliament. So TBD whether there's going to be any changes or not to it. And then its implementation date may be much, much later than right away. I expect for the C26, probably 2024. C27 may be a bit earlier. It depends where government goes with that. In terms of the fines, good question. Quebec also, oddly enough, has adopted a new piece of legislation called Law 25 or Bill 64. It's coming into force in different phases over 3 years' time. We just went through one in September of 2022, so September 22nd, 2022. And then the next round is coming next September with the fines kicking in at that point. One of the big questions that comes in is, can you, as a victim organization that has been hacked and let's say are being, you have to notify a lot of people, and for whatever reason, let's say you're subject to fines, would the Quebec regulator be able to fine you and then the federal regulator be able to fine you, and you get double whammied essentially? And there is some ambiguity as to how that would play out. Quebec's commissioner can issue a fine as a general right. Like they have that power. So when the commissaire de l'accès à l'information says, I believe I'm going to issue a fine, they don't need to get approvals. Okay. In the bill or Bill C-27 that's being proposed, the commissioner can recommend a fine, but it has to be enshrined or has to be adopted or approved by the tribunal. So there is a right of oversight by the tribunal over what the commissioner may or may not be doing or thinking in terms of fines. And if the fines are issued, then you can proceed or not. There's a lot of steps there. The big challenge is how are you going to coordinate the provincial and federal, because each has their own jurisdiction, but they should be overlapping at some level, obviously. And are they going to be deemed to be substantially similar? Those are really question marks right now.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that insight. And I just see we just got a notification. There's 10 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to the audience. If you have any questions, I've got a few other questions to ask the panel, but if there's anything from the audience that you would like to ask, you could either throw it in the chat or jump on the conversation as well. Okay, hearing nothing at this point, then I'd like to just go back to Jason. Imran kind of laid out for us some key considerations for if you've been breached, here's how you should react. What are the 3 key considerations for cybersecurity that people should take away from today?
Yeah, for sure. The 3 core considerations of cybersecurity that I created are questions we ask our clients to help guide them and to put them on the right path of becoming more cyber resilient. And they're very simple questions, right? So not as overly diverse as Bill C-26 or anything like that. And the 3 questions are, the first one is, do you understand your current overall security posture? And the reason why that gets asked to these organizations or organization leaders is because we want to understand their current security posture, but we also want them to understand it also. We don't want them to abdicate that responsibility, because in the event of any sort of incident or a breach, they're ultimately responsible for it. And therefore, we're encouraging them to do the due diligence to make sure that they understand that security posture. Number 2, the second question is, do you know what data you're currently collecting and protecting? So the reason we ask that question is because some organizations truly don't know what data they're collecting. They don't realize that they're collecting personally identifiable information or even personal health information that could put them in a privacy issue later on with PIPEDA or even the GDPR if they're collecting data from European Union members. And this is something that's very important for them to understand. The other reason why they also need to know what data they're protecting is because they also have to determine how to protect this data and what security measures they have to put into place. And then the final question is, do you know what to do in the event of an incident or a breach? And that's really straightforward. You really must know how to react or how to address an incident or a breach that happens with your organization or could happen to your organization. It's not a matter of if a cyber breach is going to happen, typically. It's a matter of when and how bad is what I usually say. And therefore, for any organization, it would be important for them to understand how to actually deal with an event or a breach or an incident or a breach, forgive me. So these 3 questions are ultimately just they're not meant to be the ultimate answer or anything like that. They're there to help people create context and figure out what they need to do next. And it would be able to address many gaps as long as it's integrated into a business's operations on a regular basis. And if you ever, if any of the audience ever has a question or needs some help on creating more cyber resiliency on, for the organization, feel free to reach out to us by email or by phone.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And actually, all 3 of you could answer this one, but I'm just picturing the war room when this happens. You've each had personal experience seeing how this unfolds. What is typical, like that first day? And I'm imagining people screaming in a room with each other, but what actually happens? Like you read about it in the paper, but what's going on?
So seeing as we recently, all 3 of us were involved in in a few of these, the first reaction that typically every organization has is, what do I do now? And we have to kind of talk them down a little bit and say, okay, guys, we need to first confirm if you actually got attacked or if this is an actual incident. There's a big difference between an event where it's just, it's an unproven or unconfirmed incident where something bad has happened, but we don't actually know that it's an incident. But once it's been confirmed that it's an actual incident, the first job for the organization is really to start avoiding the blast radius that is ensuing, right? Like, you know, we want to make sure that one, they're not shutting down systems or shutting down servers or computers, because that would take away the evidence that's required for threat hunting and forensics. But at the same time, they want to make sure that if, let's say, for example, it's a ransomware or a malware attack, they can essentially unplug the internet connection, and that buys them a little bit of time. But the next call typically would have to go to Imran or the insurance broker, and I'm actually going to let Imran take that side of things.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. So real quick, and I do want to add an additional suggestion to clients too. In terms of the call to us, and thank you, Jason. We take the call to do a few things. It's exactly what I described earlier as to explain what the breach coach would be doing, getting the right people involved. And on the insurance side, I'm not an insurance lawyer, but enough to know that you should be informing your insurer quickly. You should be sharing facts with them so they can make informed decisions from their end. I always remind clients they have common interest privilege with their insurer, meaning you have to share some information so they can make financial reserves. So share your statements of work, tell them where you stand, tell them where you're struggling in terms of restoration as well, because they are there really to support you. Other than the fact they're going to help you during the breach, at the end of the claim process, when you submit all your paperwork, they'll be actually easier to process because they'll have the full context of what's going on. But more specifically, I like to give examples that are unrelated sometimes to cyber, but that apply to the cyber world as well. There's a great book written by somebody called Jim Collins, who writes about great companies. Good to Great is one of them, How the Mighty Fall, others as well. There's another book by a gentleman who used to be at Honeywell as CEO, Win Now, Win Later. But the theme in those two books are exactly the same. It's not like you have a grand vision. You know, they're inheriting often situations which are going to change. What you need to do is have the right people right away on the bus. So the bus is the team that's going to execute on this. If you don't have the right partners early on, you're going to struggle because you won't have the benefit of the advice. To Jason's point earlier, you may have great IT folks who are superb, but their concentration, like he said, may not be on ransom negotiation. So you want to have the right ransom negotiator there who's going to give you options on tactics to negotiate or not. You want to think about post-remediation services. You want to think about your legal coach, folks like Joson who can help you with all of those different vendors to put together, and the insurer as well. So having the right people identified, onboarded right at the get-go will help actually streamline a lot of this when they know the process and know how to work with one another. The rest, I think, typically will fall into place because their combined experience with the client's knowledge of the business typically gets them to the right point.
Actually, you know what, Imran, you said it perfectly. That to segue into my point, I was going to finish off by adding that both Jason and Imran's remarks here, for organizations, how important it is to have that right people on the bus, which is your incident response plan. So, I mean, in terms of having the right plan structured that's fit for your business, it's also crucial to have a workshop or some sort of tabletop exercise to practice and test your incident response plan. So to answer your question, or maybe address that question, Brad, to yours, in terms of the panic situation versus the, hey, calm and steady. And that's where we want to be. The calm and steady is if you actually had an incident response plan, though this is a severe, catastrophic occurrence or an incident for an organization that can halt operations for X amount of days or even months. As long as you have a plan and you've practiced it, everyone knows what they're doing, we can respond quickly. And that's the whole purpose of this plan. So I think I wanted to just add that to Imran's remarks there. It's absolutely perfect for that.
Well, that is fantastic. I see we're almost at time now. If I could just ask, I've heard this, and you could just quickly tell me, are there times where somebody will ransom, they get paid, and then they come back and ransom you again because they haven't given everything? That actually happens, eh?
That happens, yeah.
Does it happen more than you would think?
Two groups actually, one ransomware group doing the first one, and then a second different group actually attacking and doing the second hit too. So
a lot of it happens, to Imran's point, you got to have the right people on the bus. sometimes, unfortunately, not everybody that you need is on the bus. And what ends up happening is that some holes are left behind from the first incident. And unfortunately, a second incident occurs and another ransomware gang manages to attack the system again.
Wow.
And actually, there was
Well-
a comment on the chat there with regards to my last comment, and she alluded to just like a fire drill. And you know what? Yes, that's what I actually say to my clients too. This is the workshop or tabletop exercise should be done annually, in terms of, because we have people coming and going out of your organization. So if you have key roles that are no longer there, that's on your incident response plan, it does no good if an incident does occur. So you always have to practice that, and absolutely just like a fire drill.
Wow. And that's probably a great way to end this conversation. Tristan, Jason, Imran, thank you so much for your time, for your insights and expertise. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I learned a lot just listening to what you were talking about, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you all very much for that. And to everyone who joined us today on this conversation, thank you very much for joining us. Have
Thank you
yourselves
for
a great
having us.
afternoon.
Thanks
you,
for having
everybody.
us.
Thank you.